chiropractic can cure allergies. Doctors have no evidence that it doesn't. Welcome to Friday Fallacy. This week we're looking at shifting the burden of proof. Shifting the burden of proof is when instead of proving your claim, your opponent is challenged to refute it. That is, rather than providing reasons or evidence for your conclusion, you instead assert that your opponent needs to disprove your claim. Now, this is not a sound way of arguing, as even if something can't be disproven, that doesn't mean that it must be true. That atheists can't prove that God doesn't exist in no way means that he must exist. That Christians can't prove that the flying spaghetti monster doesn't exist in no way means that he must exist. Some examples of shifting the burden of proof. Everyone knows that God exists, it's up to you to prove that he doesn't. Until scientists can show how consciousness works, we should assume that it comes from our soul. Don't ask what evidence do we have for Allah, instead, ask what evidence do we have for atheism. Homeopathy works, it's not like anyone's proved that it doesn't. Pushing the burden of proof onto one's opponent is not always a fallacy. The burden of proof always rests with the person who is making a claim. If someone is arguing that a God exists, it is always up to them to provide reasons for believing that. If someone is arguing that a God does not exist, then it's up to them to provide reasons for believing that. This means that the person who is responding to, or simply doubting or questioning a claim, has no onus on them. They are not required to provide an alternative explanation or an argument against the claim, but rather they are entitled to simply ask for sufficient evidence or reason. Now, one way in which the burden of proof is sometimes shifted is by misrepresenting the skeptic's position as stronger than it really is. For example, many Christians will define atheism as the belief that no God exists, whereas many atheists don't actually claim that. That is, for many, atheism is simply not being convinced that a God exists, rather than being convinced that no God exists. A useful analogy is to consider a criminal trial. In a criminal trial, it is entirely up to the prosecutor to prove that the defendant is guilty. The defence need not provide any alternative explanation for the facts, or prove that the defendant is innocent. If the prosecution fails to provide sufficient evidence, then the defendant is let go. Now, they may actually be guilty, but it hasn't been proved. Similarly, when someone makes a claim, say that God exists, then it is entirely up to them to prove this. It is not up to the atheist to provide an alternative account for how the universe came to be, or why we behave morally. If the theist fails to provide sufficient evidence or argument, then we are justified in not accepting their claims, even if their claim turns out to be true. But not accepting a claim is very different to being convinced that that claim is not true. In conclusion, shifting the burden of proof is when instead of proving your claim, your opponent is challenged to refute it instead. Until next time, keep your fallacies to yourself.